Jazz dance is as important as ballet in understanding modern and contemporary dance styles. Now, when we look at jazz dance, the varieties of jazz dance reflect the diversity of American culture. We see jazz dance mirroring the social history of the American people, reflecting ethnic influence, historic events, and cultural changes. It has been greatly influenced by social dance and popular music. But like so much that is quote-unquote from America, the history of jazz dance, well, it begins somewhere else. Looking at the origins of jazz music, we will also find the origins of jazz dance. Now, the origins of jazz music as well as dance are found in the rhythms and movements brought to America by African slaves. The style of African dance is earthy, low, knees bent, pulsating body movements, emphasizing body isolations and hand clapping. Here we see one example of many tribal forms that we see across Africa. Of course, it's a very diverse continent. As slaves were forced into America, starting during the 1600s, Africans from many cultures were cut off from their families and languages as well as their tribal traditions. The result was an intermingling of African cultures that created a new culture with both African and European elements. And what you're seeing is people who are cut off who have this commonality in that they're from Africa and they're bringing in their own individual tribal flair into something that will be much larger. Now, we also see the Slave Act of 1740, which prohibited slaves from playing African drums or performing African dances. But that did not suppress their desire to cling to those parts of their cultural identity. They're just going to take on a different form. You're going to see the use of gospel, you're going to see the use of chants, you're going to see more stomping to replace the percussion that is missing from the drums. So things will change, but the culture isn't completely lost. The rhythms and movements of African dance, the foot stomping, the tapping, hand clapping, and rhythmic vocal sounds were woven into what we now call jazz. Which brings us to a dark part of history, the minstrel shows. Now, in the 19th century, American white performers decided that they enjoyed the music and dance of slaves who had created it. And this is problematic, especially today looking back. This is obvious cultural appropriation. This is obviously very problematic, but remember the time we're in, and this is part of the history of jazz dance. Now, in minstrel shows, white entertainers parodied their conception of slave life and popularized the African style of dance and music. With white dancers as the star performers of the minstrel show and vaudeville show, it was difficult for black dancers to gain stature as part of these dance troupes. Kind of one of those odd ironies of life that the African-American performers coming in can't actually find a place in the minstrel shows, which are about their culture and their people. Because of this, many African-American performers will migrate to Europe, where they introduced newly emerging forms of jazz music and jazz dance. In Europe, those talented and innovative performances were more well received than in America. They become far more popular. In fact, jazz music will take off in Europe before it will take off in the United States. The minstrel shows themselves will evolve and eventually be absorbed into 20th century musical comedy, which is really sort of the same thing, where you see these 1960s, 1970s musical variety shows, some musicals that are comedic that we see today. These are all coming from the minstrel shows, or at least they draw back to those roots. Jazz and jazz dance will emerge slowly over time. And in fact, it will follow the Great Migration that we see around World War I, where we see African Americans in the American South moving north for industrial jobs. They will take parts of their culture with them. Now, through the end of the 1920s, Dixieland jazz music, with its fast ragtime beat, spread from New Orleans to Chicago, New York, and elsewhere. The growth of jazz dance was directly influenced by the musical genre, and we see it spread in the same way as it moves from New Orleans into the major cities of the North and again to Europe, which we've discussed already. In 1923, the Charleston was introduced, and Americans were quick to adopt it. In the Charleston, dancers used body isolation for the first time in a social dance, and the hand clapping and foot stomping that was incorporated were a direct link to the dancer's African origin, or the dance's African origins. This was also the era of Bill Bojangles Robinson, a black tap dancer who achieved world fame through the clean and clear percussive rhythms of his feet. The early forms of tap dance evolved from the Irish jig, which incorporated limited upper body movements and the lower body working within a very limited series of parameters. As the movements of tap dance became more flexible, the lightness of Robinson's style influenced the future of tap dance by changing the placement of the tap steps from the full foot to the ball of the foot, resulting in a much lighter form. Bill Robinson was seen performing on Broadway, in Hollywood films, and in shows that toured the country, and he's famous today for his influence on tap dance and jazz dance. Now, of course, we also have to deal with the Great Depression. That's going to be coming up here following World War I. Now, during the Depression of the 1930s, people escaped into dance competitions in hope of winning a cash prize or sometimes dinner or whatever else. The sound of jazz music started to change during this period due to the symphonic jazz of Paul Whiteman. So what he does is he brings full orchestration to his music and made syncopation a part of every song that he played. And this is placing an accent or emphasis on normally unaccented beats of music. It adds to the surprise and ultimately spontaneity of jazz dance as well as jazz music. The music of the African American bands of Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong will give birth to swing dance. What they will do is they will focus on the percussive element, which allows the dancers to hold a beat, which draws people into what will become swing dance. And the swing era, also termed the big band era, generated well-known dances such as the Lindy Hop, as we see here, and the Boogie Woogie. During the 1920s, we see Fred Astaire coming to the forefront, and he had become a vital part of Broadway. But in 1933, when musicals found their fame in Hollywood, he became the leading man for many movie musicals. He created a unique dance style that brought elegance to the dancer's image. What he does is he brings the flowing steps of ballet with the abruptness of jazz movements, and was the first dancer at the time to dance every musical note so that the rhythmic pattern of the music was mirrored in the dance steps. And if you look at what he's doing here, you notice he's working on his toes. He's using that influence of Robinson that we just talked about, moving the tap to the forefoot. And then he's working on the toes, giving it a very ballet-like feel. The upper body seems very graceful, while the lower body seems very jazz-like, moving very, very rapidly, maintaining that beat and rhythm. Now, with the coming of World War II, we will again see changes to jazz dance. Just when social dancing was at its height, World War II will put a stop to its popularity. Of course, many men are off fighting at the war, many women are working in the factories. You're going to see some issues with social dance. We see a lack of attendance, plus the intricate rhythmic patterns of modern jazz music, which became too complex for social dancing, led to the closing of dance halls and ballrooms. With the demise of social dance, the growth of jazz dance as a professional form began. During the 1940s, jazz dance will be influenced by ballet and modern dance. And before I move on to that, this is very similar to what happens in ballet when we get to the 16th and 17th century, where it becomes so complex that we have professional dancers taking the role of the courtiers. And we're going to see the same thing here. Again, jazz dance becomes very, very complicated, not something that your average person can keep up with. And so we see the growth and development of professionals. Now, by blending the classical technique of ballet with the natural bodily expression of modern dance, jazz dance developed a sophisticated artistic quality. Unlike early jazz dance, which was performed by talented entertainers without formal training, modern jazz dance was performed by professionals trained in ballet and modern dance, because there is no such thing as training in jazz dance at the time. Remember, we're in the 1940s. It's during this time that the man that later became known as the father of theatrical jazz dance, Jack Cole, was busy developing his technique. Now, Jack Cole had studied modern dance, ballet, and ethnic dance. And this is a result of having been a student at Denishon Studios. And he had done choreographic work in the nightclub scene. This was actually very, very common. In the 1940s, there was serious demand for groups of trained dancers for film work. And Jack Cole was the one who started developing those trained jazz dancers for the Hollywood movie musical. Also during this time, we will see Gene Kelly, who began making his mark as a dancer in Hollywood musicals, following in the footsteps of Fred Astaire and Robinson. And his impact on jazz was his individual energetic dance style that combined athletic gymnastic qualities with jazz and tap. So he's adding an athletic element to it that we hadn't seen too much in the past, at least amongst the professional jazz dancers. During the 1950s, rock and roll music will become incredibly popular. And we're going to see this played by a lot of African American musicians for many years already at this point. This rock and roll music will become popular with teenage audiences, and thus new kinds of social dance will be created to go with this type of music. During this decade, the influence of Latin American music and dance enriched jazz dance, as was seen with the landmark Broadway production of West Side Story, choreographed by Jerome Robbins. It was also during this period of time that Matt Maddox, who had been a dancer of the Jack Cole style in many Hollywood musicals, began to develop his own teaching and performing style. He was another dancer who had studied ballet, modern, and tap, and then found his love of jazz dance in his late 20s. Maddox went on to teach dance in New York for many years before moving to Europe in the 1970s and developing his school and style based on what he calls freestyle, although many people today still label him as a jazz dance teacher and choreographer. And of course, as we move into the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s, we will see revolutions in jazz dance mirroring the culture that gives birth to it. With the 1960s come a twist, as easy-to-perform overnight crazes, which brought adults back to the dance floor. Came the twist. So the twist is this new dance that's coming out of the early 1960s, as we see here. At this point, Motown becomes the major musical craze, and we're going to see major changes once again. Now, Motown came out of Detroit, and the groups featured choreographed routines mostly done by Charles Choli Atkins. Now, this idea of the lead singer being spotlighted in front while the backup singers performed choreographed moves was new and is credited to Mr. Atkins, who was brought in to Motown to work with these groups and give them a uniform look on stage. His work can be seen on Motown groups such as the Supremes, Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, and the Temptations. On the dance floor in the clubs, just as we do today, people copied these dance steps. And this will popularize that style of dance. So they're mimicking what they're seeing on stage, not unlike people mimicking what they might see in a music video today. It carried through the 1970s, 80s, and 90s in groups like En Vogue, the Jacksons, Backstreet Boys, NSYNC. I can't believe I'm saying NSYNC in a World of the Arts lecture, but I am. And is still strong today in all the vocal stage choreography you see when a singer has backup dancers. During the 1960s, two other names emerged amongst the ranks of professional jazz greats: Luigi and Gus Giordano. Now, Luigi developed his technique as a result of an auto accident that left him paralyzed on the right side. Doctors claimed he would never walk, let alone dance again. But he persisted through operations, physical therapy, and his own study of body movement based on dance exercise, and eventually was able to not only walk, but to dance and teach. The technique he developed is influenced by ballet. It's very lyrical. And his technique required that the body be exercised to its fullest to develop the strength necessary for muscle control, yet look beautiful. This should sound familiar. It's very similar to ballet, the idea that you need strength and athleticism to show off a sense of grace. Now, Gus Giordano's style is classical, but greatly influenced by the natural and freer body movements of modern dance. His technique teaches isolation movements, emphasizing the head, torso, and creating an uplifted look of elegance. In both cases, they will use yoga in their techniques as a means of relaxation, stretching, and developing the flexibility necessary for many of their moves, at least necessary if you're not going to injure yourself while trying to perform these moves. The 1970s see the disco revolution and also jazz dance moving into musicals in far greater numbers than what we've seen in the past. So, in the 1970s, Bob Fosse becomes the outstanding name in jazz dance. He performed on Broadway and in films, but his true success was ultimately as a choreographer. His work includes the films All That Jazz and Sweet Charity, the Broadway hits Dancin', and the television special Liza with a Z, among many other famous works. He will also choreograph a reproduction of Chicago in 1975. Now, his style is particularly distinct. It was highly creative and often involved bizarre movements. It was slick, erotic, and intense. He was a one-man jazz dance phenomenon whose style continued to make its mark on the Broadway stage and in Hollywood throughout the 1980s. But we see something else arising in the 1970s. Out of the urban neighborhoods, the African-American neighborhoods of New York, we see a dance phenomenon called breakdancing, which takes on, well, a lot of different forms. We see freestyle, electric boogie, popping, Egyptian, floating, etc. Now, breakdancing is going to be an umbrella term for all the forms of modern street dance that we see developing in the 1970s. These can all trace their roots to West African cultures of Mali, Gambia, and Senegal. In the late 1960s, many West African dancers came to America and settled in the South Bronx. What you get is this situation where you have sort of a critical mass. You have a lot of these West African dancers who have come to the United States, and they're going to incorporate their roots into what they see in their environment, thus creating breakdancing. Breakdancing emerges not only as an entertainment form, but as a competition, as a means of attaining superiority in street corner fraternities. It was an alternative to gang warfare. And yes, that is a gif of Vin Diesel breakdancing with hair. You're welcome. In the 1980s, things change once again. In the 80s, breakdancing exploded out of these environments into the mainstream. So it's going to move from the streets into mainstream culture. In this same period of time, jazz dance further expanded its horizons when it combined with physical fitness classes to make exercise more fun and sociable. Yes, this famous video from YouTube is in fact people performing jazz dance. I'll let you judge for yourself. The result was a new hybrid known as aerobic dance classes. The most prominent name in the 1980s musical theater is going to be Andrew Lloyd Webber, who is acclaimed for shifting the focus of the Broadway musical from America to the London stage. His musical hits include Jesus Christ Superstar, Phantom of the Opera, and the hottest musical of the 80s, Cats, with choreography by Gillian Lynne. By the way, that same musical becomes a really horrible movie in 2019 and may have caused the chaos of 2020. I'm not saying it's the case, but there's a good likelihood. Jazz dance in the 1980s received a tremendous boost from prominent movies of the decade, such as Fame, Flashdance, Footloose, Staying Alive, Breaking, and Dirty Dancing. Attendance in jazz dance classes skyrocketed, with students eager to conquer this exciting dance form. American businesses will also notice the large audience appeal of jazz dance and move quickly to capitalize on the craze, including commercials incorporating jazz dance, which will appear for Panasonic, Coca-Cola, and many fast food chains, sort of ironically. Television will actually play a surprisingly large role when it comes to the popularity and development of jazz dance. Now, the 1980s also saw the introduction of MTV, a new medium for dance and professional dancers. When MTV began broadcasting in 1981, they actually played music videos. I know this is shocking, but they did at one time. But these music videos combined high-energy jazz, ballet, street dance, and social dance in striking and innovative ways. And we see major choreographers of the period such as Michael Peters, Jeffrey Hornaday, Lester Wilson, Madonna, Paula Abdul, and Janet Jackson. The supreme video star of the 1980s, of course, is going to be Michael Jackson. Now, he made a major impact on the direction of jazz dance with his creative dance steps, his videos, his presentation, and his choreography, most of which was done by Michael Peters or Jackson and Peters as a team. Two other names to add to the list of professional instructors who had influenced the development of jazz dance are Frank Hatchett and Joe Tremaine. Entertainers, students, and dance teachers from all over the world would come to study with Frank Hatchett. The Frank Hatchett style is a blend of strength, funk, and individual interpretation, with an emphasis on selling your performance. Associated exclusively to Frank Hatchett, his unique energy and spirit have come to be called VOP. Joe Tremaine started studying in New York in the 1960s and later appeared in many television specials and variety shows. His teaching style is comparable to his style on the dance floor, up to the minute, fast, flashy, and funky. A variety of techniques that he brought from New York are also part of his unique style, which is often referred to as West Coast jazz or LA jazz. This style is driven by current musical trends, is rhythmic and jazzy. Here he's channeled his enthusiasm for dance in another direction as well, his own dance conventions and competitions, because why not capitalize on a good thing? In the 1990s, well, things continued to develop with large hair and all of the things you think of with the early 90s. In the 90s, the jazz dance world, the buzzword in training centers was street dance, street funk, and hip-hop. Street dance is an inner-city dance taken directly from the street corners with performers using boom boxes as their accompaniment. Now, the Fly Girls dancers featured on the early 80s hit show In Living Color gave many primetime viewers their first look at street dancing. Their choreographer, Rosie Perez, is credited with the development of this style of jazz, which mix street moves with technical ballet and jazz moves. Ballet, again, coming into jazz dance. And it's come in multiple times now. So you know that it's going to be influential. And really, all of these dance styles, modern dance, jazz dance, ballet, are intermingling on a regular basis. Street dancing may be considered an umbrella dance term that encompasses funk, popping, breakdancing, and hip-hop. Which brings us to hip-hop. Now, hip-hop dance is done to hip-hop music. The dance style uses the whole body, including complex footwork, body isolation, breakdancing, and gymnastics moves. And it comes out of the hip-hop culture that we see developing in urban centers throughout the United States. Hip-hop is really a style of clothes and attitude, as well as dance and music. It's far more than simply a dance form. Jazz dance in the new century continues to both look back to the classics for inspiration and move forward to create new dance performances. In film, jazz dance, hip-hop, and ballet have fused in the box office in successes such as, well, Hamilton. Today, jazz dance is recognized as a uniquely American contribution to dance art. It's something that is purely ours, developing from the melting pot that is the United States. If it weren't for slaves and slave culture back in the 17th century, if it weren't for the development of all of these different themes and the movements of jazz dance back and forth between cultures, the influence of different dance forms, we wouldn't have it today. And it's typically American in that mixing of form that we see here. There's no purity, there's no codification, there's only self-expression.